So the last piece in our conversation about nuclear weapons is related to missile defense. And so we talked about how a changing nuclear security situation of more and more countries having nuclear weapons means that the United States has looked at different ways to potentially nullify the threat of nuclear weapons and of rogue states. And that's been part of that has been missile defense. And so the idea is that if a rogue state were to acquire a weapon of mass destruction, specifically a nuclear weapon, and they also had ballistic missiles that could strike the United States, that would be bad for the United States, right? That would mean that the United States potentially could be struck in a first strike attack with a nuclear weapon by a rogue state. The U.S. would be able to retaliate, certainly, but it would be an incredibly painful blow to lose a city in that way. Additionally, when a state develops that kind of nuclear capacity, it becomes much more difficult to coerce or threaten or demand certain policy behaviors from a state because they have an effective deterrent. They can simply say, well, you can't escalate against us militarily because we have this retaliatory strike that we could launch against you. It would be so painful that it wouldn't make sense for you to attack us. So it changes that kind of balance of what's militarily possible when a country has this kind of nuclear deterrent. Missile defense would be able to counter both those problems, right? If a rogue state has one or two nuclear weapons and it launches one or two missiles in a preemptive strike against the United States could potentially shoot down those missiles. Similarly, if the United States launched an attack on a rogue state with one or two nuclear weapons, those nuclear weapons get launched as a deterrent. They get shot down. They end up being ineffective. And so missile defense is sort of a way of getting around the problems of nuclear weapons on a small scale. Not that there's necessarily a real immediate danger of rogue states getting nuclear weapons and the ability to strike the United States. North Korea has nuclear weapons. It's working on ballistic missile technology. It could currently strike South Korea or Japan, U.S. allies, but I don't believe it has the capability to hit the United States at this point, at least not with anything approaching reliability. Similarly, Iran has regionally effective ballistic missiles. It could strike Israel. It could strike Turkey. It might even be able to reach into Europe, but it doesn't have nuclear weapons currently that it could use to make those missiles far more destructive and dangerous and terrifying. When we're thinking about missile defense, there's a couple different ways that this could be done. The most common way, the way people typically think about it, is to develop interceptor missiles. This is pejoratively described as hitting a bullet with a bullet. But the idea is that there's an incoming missile, that it goes up and it's following its trajectory down. And it's following just sort of a predictable path. That's what ballistic means. It means it's falling under the trajectory of gravity. And once you identify what that path that the missile is taking, you launch interceptor missiles that are able to knock it out of the sky, figure out where it's going to be, and be there for a collision. Physics on this being dodgy is maybe an understatement. It's really hard to get this to work, even with under ideal circumstances where the U.S. knows that there's like one missile coming in. They know where it's roughly going to be. They know the path it's going to take. The success rate has been not the kind of success rate you'd want to roll the dice with. I think 70-80% maybe with multiple interceptors. On top of that, it's a fairly expensive program. The U.S. spends around $15 billion every year just on missile defense. And then other countries, particularly Russia, but also China, are very opposed to these anti-ballistic missile systems, seeing them as baby steps in the direction of neutralizing their nuclear deterrents, which aren't sort of one or two or three missiles, but potentially a widespread nuclear confrontation. So there's maybe some pushback against that current approach and maybe some feasibility problems. Another approach that could be utilized would be to rapidly identify and destroy missiles on the ground before they're launched. So hitting a bullet in the gun with a bullet, I guess would be the metaphor if I was going to keep that going. This would work if you had a rough sense of where launch sites were, right? Where you knew roughly where vehicles or where a missile was placed. You had a way of monitoring it so that you could tell if it was being primed and getting, if a country's getting ready to use that missile. And that would be easier to do if a country is relying upon liquid fuel for its missiles, where you would, park the missile and then fuel it, and then launch it, rather than solid fuel where you can fuel the missile and then move it around wherever you need to go, and then launch it, because the fuel is more stable. So under certain circumstances, maybe you could identify a country looks like they're moving toward launching a strike, they're fueling missiles, and if you have some sort of interceptor close enough, you could maybe launch that and hit that missile on the ground at its fueling site. That would be maybe more feasible with current technology, but it still has a lot of unknowns associated with it. But I'd maybe encourage us to step back a second and think critically about, like, what actually is happening with missile defense and what it's actually doing. And so we've talked about some of the concerns the United States faces, concerns from a conventional nuclear strike involving the Soviet Union type situation. We're talking about massive arsenals being thrown all at once. I don't think anything in the U.S. missile defense program would ever be able to shoot down a massive onslaught of nuclear weapons. So we're not necessarily solving that problem. Another problem that the United States has wrestled with is this concern about nuclear terrorism. But I'd also point out that terrorist organizations typically don't use ballistic missiles. That if you're a terrorist organization, you get your hands on a nuclear weapon, you're not going to try to find a missile to bolt it to. You're going to find some other mechanism to deliver it, whether that's, a truck bomb, whether that's putting in a container ship and floating across the ocean, or something that is going to be maybe low tech and easily deployed, rather than something like a missile. And you're not going to get any protection against those clandestine attacks with a missile defense system, and investing in missile defense systems don't help you there. But I'd also argue that missile defense systems don't really help you against that sort of rogue state scenario either, right? Where a country has a small number of ballistic missiles, they've got a small number of nuclear weapons. They're not going to be able to launch nuclear Armageddon, but they might be able to hit a city. If that's the adversary that you're dealing with, that country will never, ever, ever launch a nuclear missile strike against a country with missile defense, which is not the same as saying that country will not target you. It just means that they won't use missiles to do it, right? And so if the US has an effective missile defense system, North Korea will decide that deploying its nuclear arsenal on missiles is not an effective strategy, and will look for other mechanisms to deploy those nuclear weapons, whether that's putting them in submarines and floating them across the ocean, blowing them up in a port city. I don't know, but they'll find alternative mechanisms, because you don't waste your nuclear weapons on countries that can shoot them down in the air. The other thing that's maybe worth flagging is that ballistic missiles are not the same as cruise missiles. A cruise missile sort of continues to have the ability to change course and direction as it's flying. Those are a heck of a lot harder to hit, because you can't calculate in advance the trajectory that they're going to follow, and you're not going to gain that kind of protection against those kind of weapons. So there's some real limitations to missile defense systems as a solution to these kind of problems, which is why this has been a part of a much broader effort by the United States to limit the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction.